Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event tonight with Tim McLoughlin in conversation with Kenji Jasper, discussing alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, stories, and essays. For regular updates on our upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter. We've got a bunch of in-person ones coming up in April, as well as a few more virtual events. This evening's virtual event will end with a Q&A, so to submit a question, just use the Ask Your Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We'll try and answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, consider supporting our bookstore and the author's work by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process uninterrupted from the stream. Now, a few words about our featured guest. Kenji Jasper is the author of the novels Dark, Snow, and Seeking Salamanca Mitchell. His writings have appeared in Brooklyn Noir, Atlanta Noir, The Speed Chronicles, and on National Public Radio. Tim McLoughlin is the editor of the multiple award-winning anthologies Brooklyn Noir and Brooklyn Noir 2, and co-editor of Brooklyn Noir 3. His novel Heart of the Old Country won Italy's Premio Pen Award and was the basis for the motion picture The Narrows. Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Stories and Essays, his latest work, draws on a lifetime lived in New York City and his 30-year career in the criminal justice system. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Tim and Kenji. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation, everyone.
How you doing, Tim?
So far, so good, Kenji. It's good to see you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Tim and I had the pleasure of doing a sort of pre-version of this about a year ago. We've known each other for a long time, so I hope that you get a chance to know his work, the beauty of his work, the honesty of his work, the depth of his spirit, and he's going to read a little bit and let you know who he is.
Thank you much.
Take your time, Tim. Go ahead.
I'm going to read the introduction to the book, which is pretty short, and then just the first couple of pages of one of the essays. At the end of the day, I tell ghost stories. Whether I'm writing mysteries or humor, fiction or essays, I write about ghosts. People left so far behind that they move virtually unseen through today's city. They're wandering exiles, living in an endless drift expedition. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is different. Nostalgia rolls in from the suburbs, vaguely sad, increasingly misremembering, and with a whiff of superiority for having fled to a better life. Nostalgia is the line outside Villabate Alba Bakery on 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst during Christmas week. Cars double parked for 2 blocks with New Jersey and Pennsylvania plates. Nostalgia is the crowd at the Danish Athletic Club for the St. Lucia celebration. Ghost stories are the club the rest of the year. Ghost stories are those of people living in $4 million brownstones with no mortgage because the house has been in the same family for generations. But the owners have to clip coupons for 2-for-1 Subway sandwich specials. They have tenants as old as they are or older, sometimes also inherited and paying less in rent than an indoor parking space in the neighborhood commands. They could sell and live like kings, these ghosts. But where? Why are they tethered to a particular place? What happened to them here that compels endurance? Bound by a feeling of helplessness and rage, they move through a world that on a good day has abandoned them, and on a bad day conspires to destroy them. I cannot take a single step in this city without feeling the weight of ghosts, the dead ones and the ones that walk with us. Yet no place I know is more scornful of the past, less loyal and sentimental. It's all swift, vicious movement, march or die commerce and art. And here's the funny part. The ghosts wouldn't have it any other way. It's in the DNA of this love-hate relationship. To live here, you are required to attend your own funeral, repeatedly. These pieces were written over a period of 20 years, and much has changed during that time in this march or die town and its environs. Rather than update them, I prefer to let the older ones stand as time capsules. The Maharaja essay, for example, takes place mostly at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City between 1999 and 2000, long before the casino failed and its owner graduated from local embarrassment to global nightmare. As I gradually became aware that the stories and essays were taking on a narrative arc of their own, I started writing new ones to fill in the gaps. Half the pieces here were written for that purpose and are appearing for the first time. It's not all about the ghosts, I tell myself sometimes. A few of these essays are fairly lighthearted, and after all, my own recent writing is increasingly personal. Then I remember the underrated gambling movie Rounders and its protagonist, Matt Damon's Mike McDermott. Early on, he says, "Listen, here's the thing. If you can't spot the sucker in your first half hour at the table, then you are the sucker." It occurs to me now that if you're a guy who tells ghost stories and you can't identify the ghost on your first pass, then you are the ghost. Boom. So that's the intro. And I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the last essay, sensitively titled Pimps and Hoes.
All right.
Some years back, I went down to Atlantic City with a couple of friends for what we dubbed a mental health weekend. A little gambling, too much alcohol and rich food, just three guys horsing around. About an hour after we'd arrived, one of my buddies got lucky and won $1,500 on a 50-cent slot machine. We stuck $500 in his shoe, declared a moratorium on betting, and set about spending the remaining $1,000 over the next 18 hours. It was Halloween weekend, and the casino at which we were staying, the Borgata, was throwing a Pimps and Hoes party. We'd had no prior knowledge of the event, and since we hadn't anticipated a windfall, we were woefully ill-prepared for any sort of costume affair, unless the theme was middle-aged assholes. But we attended, and mingled with the festive group that was taking this game very seriously. Provocatively clad women in fetish outfits hung on the arms of white guys done up like Superfly, complete with feathered hats and canes. A woman in her 30s who was dressed like a schoolgirl in a short plaid skirt, saddle shoes, and pigtails approached me at the bar and asked why I wasn't in costume. "Oh, I'm in costume," I said. "Really?" she said. "What are you?" "I'm a pimp." "Pimps don't look like that." Sadly, I said, "This is exactly what they look like." I smiled and she moved off quickly. Pimps are people who put prostitutes to work and take a cut of their earnings. Decked out in my most fly khakis and florshimes, I was the only real pimp in the room. I had started working as a court officer in Brooklyn Criminal Court in the summer of 1983. I'd been born and raised in Brooklyn, and I've still never lived anywhere else. At the time, I considered myself a reasonably savvy New Yorker, having come of age in the 1970s. I'd gone to high school on 16th Street in Chelsea, and the streetwalkers off Lexington Avenue would proposition and taunt me and my friends as we made our way to the subway station after school. They'd tease us with offers of student discounts, pull at our clothes when we went by, and as 14-year-old boys, we were nervous and thrilled. It was a dramatically different experience 11 years later when I first saw prostitutes brought before the court for arraignment. These were Brooklyn hookers in the 1980s. They looked tired, defiant, and addled. They wore sweatshirts and torn jeans and sneakers. They in no way resembled the exotic women of taxi driver era Manhattan. Brooklyn was a world away from Manhattan back then, and crack had arrived. The first 6 or 7 cases were called quickly. They were called so quickly that it took me a few moments to realize that pleas had been taken and sentences imposed. But they all had one thing in common. Every case was resolved with the imposition of a fine. No jail time, no community service. I was instructed to escort the women along with their paperwork to the cashier's office and remain with them until their names were called and the fines paid. Then they were free to leave, and I returned to the courtroom. This was repeated 4 or 5 times on my first day of work, and by the end of my shift, over 24 women had been arraigned, sentenced, and released. The following week, I bumped into the arraignment ADA at Callahan's, a bar on Remsen Street, conveniently located within 3 blocks of the criminal, civil, and family courts. Most court officers, clerks, and lawyers converge there a lot of nights, especially toward the end of the week. I asked this ADA why the prostitution cases were disposed of with fines instead of jail time. No prost is going to plead out to jail time, he said. They'd fight the cases, clog the system. We'd never get through the day. But they're hookers, I said, and we're fining them. Do you think they're going to get jobs as office temps to pay these fines? Small potatoes, he said. You have to pick your fights. Does it bother you? I don't know, I said honestly. I just never saw myself as a pimp.
Well, my first question to you is probably the most obvious. Working in the courts and choosing to write a whole lot about crime, every day has to be an inspiration for something you could write but don't. Is that true? Like so what's that like? I mean, do you pick and choose? Is it what stays with you? Sort of talk to me a little bit about your 9-to-5 existence so I can understand like your alter ego as a writer.
That's a great question. When I first started in the court system, I had always had an interest in writing from the time I was a teenager, but as with many of us, it got put on the side as you enter adult life and you start paying bills and rent. And I think that the urge to record this came back dramatically almost as soon as I started working in uniform. And I used to keep a little spiral notebook in my shirt pocket, and I would make notes about conversation, snippets of conversation, and what I used to call the elevator stories. Because if you got on the elevator on the first floor with a group of people, by the time they got off on the 8th floor, you had a novel. It was just extraordinary what would transpire in those few minutes of going up to a courtroom. And you would have somebody saying to someone else, I hope that guy can't identify him. I hope he can't identify him. I hope he gets it wrong. And then the other person said, well, yesterday you said he wasn't there. So you're watching all of this sort of shift as we're getting closer to the moment of truth, so to speak. And it certainly changed how I saw myself because, as I mentioned, I think in that essay, as a teenager and even a young adult, I sort of thought of myself as a halfway savvy New York kid. And about 2 weeks into working in criminal court, I realized I didn't know shit. There was so much going on. There was such a world out there that was really quite new to me. And my first year of working in the court system was an extraordinary education. My first arrest, the first person I locked up, I'm still deeply grateful to them because when I made my first arrest, the people that I worked with indicated to me that when you get to central booking, there'll be someone there who will walk you through the arrest process. Well, the only person that walked me through the arrest process was the guy I locked up. I got to central booking. I walked through the door of the precinct. I stood there like a deer in headlights, and I don't know what I'm doing. And he looked at me, he was a little disappointed in me, you could tell. And he said, first you got to take me over there. Then they got to photograph me. Then they got to check me for prints. And he walked me through the entire process. And all I did all night long was I kept buying him candy bars out of the vending machine. Because, without that guy, I'd still be there today. He got me through my first arrest.
Well, and this is probably one of the things you said in our last interview was that you're a very sometimey writer, or that your discipline isn't always where you felt like it should be. So, how do you pick and choose? How did you pick and choose in putting together the stories here? And how come? Because I've read most of the book. how come the actual realities, the nonfiction of your days, doesn't make it into your work more as much as one would assume that it would? Like one would think if it was a cop, you know, and a cop has this sort of time moonlighting, they tell all the cop stories. Like sort of what is how do you sift through what you can say and what you can't, and what motivates your narratives? Like what gets you to sit down and write?
Unfortunately, almost the only thing that gets me to sit down and write is a deadline, although I've actually very, very late in life gotten a little bit better at that. I've always worked in spurts. You know, I'll not write for a month and then sit down and write 12 hours a day for 5 or 6 days when I get caught up in something. And I was pretty lucky with this book in that as I had mentioned a little earlier before we went live, I had a manuscript put together, but the Akashic publisher, Johnny Temple, felt that a couple of the pieces were not quite right in terms of the vibe, the overall narrative arc. And so he pulled them, and that forced me to go back and write new pieces to fill in those spots. And I'm really glad that occurred, because that was what the book was, in my opinion, that was what the book was missing. And I was not able to see that until he showed it to me. So those pieces were written to fill in little gaps sort of in my life, in my career. And some of the essays were hard to write, like the essay about Greg Scarpa and growing up in that neighborhood. That was a hard essay for me to write. And when I was done writing that essay, sort of to shake off the heaviness of that feeling, I wrote the essay about the T-shirt seizures, because that was a really easy, fun essay for me to write, because it was a fun story, and it was a.
All right. You know what? You got to tell that story now. Now that you brought it up, just for everyone that's listening, just tell us about the Seizure Story.
Okay,
it's one of my favorites in the book. So
thank you. When one of the things that I discovered early on, when I first started working as a court officer in the early 1980s, if you could legally carry a gun in New York City, people offered you all kinds of jobs. There were employment opportunities all over the place. And my life up until that point, any work that anybody offered me involved either lifting heavy objects or driving a car. You know, that was, you know, the nature of labor, of work before you had a career, when you were just sort of hustling. And now suddenly I had a gun and a badge, and people were offering me a lot of money to do what I felt were pretty easy jobs. And, you know, you discover they're easy jobs up until the moment that they're not easy anymore, which is when something bad happens. But I wound up doing a lot of security work, all kinds of jobs. And then one day, a boss from a private security company I was working for at Radio City asked me if I would be interested in working what he referred to as trademark enforcement. And I didn't know what that meant, but he said, you know, no more business suits, no more uniform. You blend in with the crowd. And basically, anytime a major event was jumping off at Madison Square Garden or Radio City, there were always people selling bootleg product outside. And the venue and the artists would get an injunction to prevent them from doing that. And of course, they were doing it anyway, and it was half the price of the stuff that was inside. And we were authorized, we had a little notice, a piece of paper from a federal judge, that we were supposed to serve on these vendors and seize their product. So essentially we were robbing people, because, you know, we had it was legal, but it still felt like you were robbing somebody. You were taking their product from them and you weren't compensating them for it. And these were just guys hustling for a job. So it began with kind of being a contentious relationship. But then the really strange thing that happened was I got to know the vendors pretty well. We all had our meal break at the same time. Once a concert started, there's nothing to do. So we would all go to McDonald's on 7th Avenue across from Madison Square Garden. And we would sit across from each other and we'd start talking. And we started interacting socially. And one of the interesting things about those federal orders that I mentioned is that nobody cared about them. You know, nobody gave a damn about any of this stuff. At the end of the night, all of the product that we confiscated was thrown on the floor in this big room in Madison Square Garden, and then it was sent out to be destroyed. So nobody was keeping track of product. So I had an order that I was supposed to initial how many items I took from somebody, but no one cared. But these kids that were selling the shirts were getting them from some sort of mob-backed guys from Jersey that used to print 1,000 shirts and bring a van down and give them to the kids 10 shirts at a time. So I began seizing 2 or 3 shirts and giving them an order that says I took 7. They would be able to sell the other 4 shirts and keep the money, bring the order back to the guys in the van. They were making more money than they ever made before. I was seizing more product. Everybody was making out. It was working out spectacularly. The only problem was, you know, you become a victim of your own success. We were all supposedly out there and, you know, making sure that these guys didn't sell shirts. And we would show up for work and they would be running over trying to give us the shirts. So that looks pretty bad to your bosses. So we had to be like, you know, chill out, guys, chill out. And, you know, make our deals around the corner or in alleys. But at the end of the night, we were still seizing product. They were making their money. And it became a system that worked. And, you know, even in terms of the expenditure to have us out there seizing the product, it wasn't about seizing product. It was about the acts not losing their copyright on the product. So as long as somebody was making a show of taking something away, it all worked. So for about 1.5 years, it was the best side gig of my career because I showed up for work. You know, as I say in the essay, it was like Ralph and Sam, you know, the sheepdog and the wolf. You know, we showed up, we pretended to chase each other around in case the bosses were looking. And then we hung out together. And we had a great run.
That's the beauty of New York. At least I think a New York that you and I can speak to. I feel like
Yes.
the Gen Z experience, millennial experience is a little different. You know, there's a lot of like this New York is whack kind of thing. And the time I spent there, I'm not a native, but there are so many different worlds. There's also what I like to talk about as New York racism. And what I mean by New York racism being different from collective racism is that it's built around the fact that everyone's ethnically stratified in different places. And we spend so much time in our own worlds that we're very, very skeptical, prejudiced. You know, what's going on over the hill is always something that if it doesn't scare us, you know, we at least have to dismiss the fact that it's not our neighborhood. And I'm leading all it up to asking a question. I mean, you grew up, your father was a police officer. You grew up with around a number of cops. Am I wrong? Is that correct?
My father worked for the transit authority, but
Okay.
2 of my uncles were police officers, and most of my extended family, everybody was in law enforcement.
So who was it that got you out of the graffiti bus at the beginning, at the first story? Who that wasn't your dad? It was an uncle.
Well, that's a short story, so that's sort of an amalgam of a couple of different. That's not one of the essays. So, but
that's the hard thing, as we were saying earlier. The voice is so strong. What's true and what's not, you can't tell the difference.
Well, I'll tell you that in the story I made it the father, and in real world it was an uncle.
Okay, there we go. So you answered my question. Thank you. In terms of that story, and let me give it a precluded in saying that it's a story about an Irish kid who is arrested. It starts with him being arrested for tagging graffiti with some of his Latino friends. And the first question I came to, everything I know about you, Tim, was, were you a tagger at that time in New York? Did you go out? Did you go out into the yards?
I extraordinarily briefly, very, very briefly early on. It was more social. It was more people that I was that I knew. I would say at that, when I was about 19, it was just jumping off. I never once broke into a train yard. No, because my father was still alive and he would have killed me as a transit worker. So yeah, but I was moving around that community because I was in and out of college part-time down at NYU, and there were a lot of kids on the edge of the community that were just started tagging, but they were also very involved in the music scene and the art scene. And so what became kind of weird was that by age 23, I was working as a night watchman in the train yards, and there were guys that I knew from Lower Manhattan that were breaking in there, writing on trains and doing really elaborate pieces. And my job was to chase them. Actually, my job was to hold them and call the authorities, which I'm pleased to say that in my entire tenure in the Transit Authority, I never did. I used to fill out a form that said, individuals spotted 1:30 a.m. In the Coney Island yard or over by track whatever. By the time we arrived, they had left. And I used to run over there and say, "Get out of here! For Christ's sake, somebody's going to catch you."
What does it mean? And this is a big question. I can only ask from your own vantage point. What does it mean to you? What were you taught that it meant to be Irish in your particular school? What I mean by that is that in your neighborhood, in your family, and your sense of your own cultural identity, what does it mean to be an Irish New Yorker? What does it mean to be an Irish American person, particularly in this climate?
Wow.
And chew on it.
Yeah, 20 words or less. I can tell you that growing up as a very young kid, the part of Bay Ridge that we lived in was almost entirely Irish and Scandinavian. And when I was around 10, I'm going to say 10 years old, we moved to the borderline of Bay Ridge and Bensonhurst. And from that point forward, my school experience was almost entirely Italian. So it was a giant ethnic shift, as you were talking about a little while ago about those little enclaves. This was a big change for me. And my early days as an Irish American blue collar kid in Bay Ridge were mostly informed by family. But once we moved up to the Bensonhurst border, and then you get more social outside of your family and groups and all, I almost felt that I was culturally Italian, because that was my entire social world. And that was a rather dramatic change. But it was, it was also, it informed my upbringing, and it certainly was part of the world by the time I began driving for the neighborhood car service. That was extremely Italian-American bent to it. The Irish part of the family were still the ones that were all the cops and firemen. Cops, firemen, court officers, correction officers. And the other experience on the ethnically speaking, growing up in the Italian neighborhood, that was a little bit more knockaround, or at least it felt it to me.
I got you. Talking about Bay Ridge, your home neighborhood, in what ways have you seen it change since you were growing up? And does it still carry the same energy and the same reputation that it did when you were a boy?
Yes and no. It has changed significantly, and it interests me the way that it's changed. It also interests me the way that it has not. So it has changed ethnically, and I usually, for the most part, I think that's a good thing. Immigrant groups change, new waves, new generations. When I was growing up there, as I said, it was mostly Italian and Scandinavian. Then for a while it became heavily Greek, and then it became Asian and Middle Eastern. Now there's still a big Irish population, still a substantial Scandinavian population for New York City, but those are the waves of immigration. So what changes are the individuals. What stays the same is the vibe of the neighborhood, and that neighborhood is a pretty strong vibe. So to my way of looking at it, there's not a great deal of difference between me and a dozen Irish and Italian guys hanging out on the corner trying to look tough and trying to meet girls, or a bunch of Middle Eastern and Asian guys hanging out on the corner trying to look tough and trying to meet girls, because the vibe of the neighborhood has not changed at all. So that's kind of nice. If anything makes me a little bit concerned, it's not new waves of immigration, and it's not shifting ethnic groups. It's probably a little bit more gentrification, that, which I know is what upsets everybody, but it's just that's what'll change a working class neighborhood or even a middle class neighborhood into something else, and that concerns me. My father worked for the transit authority. He was able to buy a house and send me to college. Today, if you worked in the transit authority, you have to sleep on your mom's couch in Bay Ridge. So that's the change that I don't like to see.
One of my favorite, another one of my favorite pieces in the book is the amnesty box, where you talk about a number of different things, but one of which is the day in the life of being a postal police officer. Mm-hmm. What was that like? Talk a little bit about, because I was always wondered what the postal police do, and here it is, yet another law enforcement gig that you have. So you're like the super of New York. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know a tremendous amount about being a postal police officer. I transferred that story. I transferred. I put a couple of different real people together to create that character, and I decided to move it from the courthouse to a post office, because the jobs that those guys were doing were the jobs that I did for 3 years, I think it was, in Brooklyn Criminal Court. So that was where the magnetometers got set up and searching people, and the stuff that comes in and what you do with it and what you don't do with it. And that all was transferred from my personal experience working in the court system. And I did know, again, just socially, I knew a lot of postal police officers, and I picked that occupation to have that character engage in, because it struck me as fairly similar to what a court officer does, in that I don't know a better way to put this, but you have a gun and a badge, but you also work indoors. You don't wind up chasing people down dark alleys at night. You get a lot of holidays off because the post office is closed. So it was kind of a nice gig to have within the law enforcement community, much as court officer was. They used to, all of the branches in New York City have their their phrases. You know, the police department calls itself New York's finest. Correction officers call themselves New York's strongest. And shortly after I started on the job, there was sort of a wave that was just sort of mentioned under their breath about court officers, where they said, New York's smartest, because we're working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, with an hour for lunch, and we don't get rained on. So that was why I picked Postal Police, because it had a similar vibe of, if you're in the law enforcement world, it was a pretty cool gig.
I'm going to throw out a couple of different words, and I just want you to respond in whatever way seems best. The first word is Catholicism.
That's pretty interesting, because at the book launch party on the 1st, the gentleman that I was talking to asked about the Catholic vibe in the book, and I had not thought about it seriously until then, but obviously it's out there.
Yes,
And
yes, it is.
It's pretty interesting, because there is such an old school. Again, I've talked about this in getting back to the idea of ghosts and the difference between nostalgia and ghost stories. And nostalgia being people that are always talking about the good old days and looking back at the way things were when they were younger. And the ghosts are the people who move through the world as though nothing has changed. And New York City, I think America in general has become a more secular society in the last several decades, but not to a lot of the people that I write about, whether it's in fact or fiction. They are still moving through a bubble where, you know, if my father was hanging out with friends and he turned to leave, the last thing he would say was, "See you around the parish," because that was how you were identified. Nobody asked if you were from Bay Ridge or Sunset Park. They asked if you were from St. Francis Xavier or Raphael. They wanted to know what parish you were in. So there is a very strong Catholic sensibility to, certainly to my upbringing and to everything that I write about. It's there. If it's not on the surface, it's just under the surface.
All right. Word number 2. Phrase number 2. Ed Koch.
Wow, Ed Koch. I would say, you know, looking at the length of his career, he was a pretty interesting guy, and he got in over his head a bunch of times, but he was a character, and he was a real New York character. And I obviously had my moments of liking him and my moments of hating him, as most New Yorkers did. I think his defining moment was the transit strike. You know, putting himself out on the Brooklyn Bridge and trying to rally the city at those points. But he also dropped the ball a bunch of times.
All right. Jameson Irish whiskey.
Yes, thank you.
Good answer.
Yeah, it was my dad's drink. It is often but not always mine. It's a running character. Yeah, it's right there in most of the stories, because how could it not be? It is, to me, it's a piece of New York history, a piece of New York barroom history.
All right. 45 caliber pistol.
Again, it probably makes me a dinosaur, but that is also a part of my New York. I will tell you that I retired in 2013 from the court system with just under 31 years. And they had begun transitioning officers over to the Glocks, over to newer firearms years earlier, probably 10 years before I retired. But they weren't allowed to force you to switch. And I was still carrying a .38 revolver. I had a .38 Colt Detective Special, and I never gave it up. And by the time I retired, my last year of requalifying, there were 21 people at the academy that had to go down and requalify that day, and I was the only person with a revolver. Everyone else had gone over to a Glock. And they tried to make it harder for the revolver shooters because the Glock held, whatever it was, 15, 16 rounds. And they would constantly say, 4 shots here, 3 shots there, 4 shots here, 3 shots there. And these guys could just keep pulling the trigger. And I had to keep unloading and reloading. But I refused to transition because it was a classic weapon. It was to me, it was old time New York. And I wasn't going to go over. And I just barely made it.
Are you still repping so hard for old school New York that you're not going to go over?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No, I was saying, are you still rooting for old school New York, or do you accept the fact that that era has come and gone?
Both. Of course, I still root for it. I root for it. I mourn it. I champion it. To the extent that I can, I'm a part of it. But I also face the fact that I'm sometimes proudly part of the problem. I was, really upset when they condemned a lot of buildings and tore them down to put up Barclays Center. And now I go to Barclays Center because, honestly, it's a pretty cool stadium. So I recognize that cities change. And I don't object to that, and I don't want to be that kind of a dig your heels in geezer. But on the other hand, there are things that I don't want to see happen. Not to get too heavily into politics, but, for everybody was upset with de Blasio when he got elected because they said he was a socialist. And my problem with de Blasio was that he was nowhere near enough of a socialist, because where the hell did the affordable housing go? I didn't see de Blasio. I didn't see a single developer he didn't like. And so things about New York that change that are cultural, or, my favorite bakery closes, that kind of stuff, I think happens to all of us. But the thing that I can't settle in well with is the fact that working class people have to live in New Jersey now. They have to commute into the city. And there's been this huge flip of, what was the white flight of the 60s and 70s. All those people's kids and grandchildren are now back in the city. And working class people have to live in the suburbs because they can't afford to live where they grew up.
Yeah, that's going on everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Not just in New York, unfortunately. Almost every major city in America. And it's been a generational shift. Gen Z will be the last generation to probably remember this particular transformation. Mm-hmm. Just like the last one for me took place when I was in the crib, when I was an infant, a toddler, from the 70s going into the 80s. So
yeah.
How do you pick and choose what you write about? And what I mean by that is that you have concerns, but you also have reflections and memories. What do you go into the writing process knowing what you're going to do, or do you just start with something small and try to build it out until you have something that's recognizable as what your intent might have been for a first draft? No one's first draft is great, but how do you get into your first drafts?
Increasingly, as I've gotten older, increasingly I outline and flesh out work. I used to do a lot more seat of my pants stuff, but I think that coming with age, if not wisdom, is I have a lot more work that I want to do now. So I don't tend to wake up and get an idea and sit down and start scribbling. I tend to say, let me get to work on this goddamn idea that I've been putting on the side for a year and a half. So a lot of my notes, a lot of my prompts are things that have been sort of stewing for a few years that I want to get to. So in that regard, I will tell you, for example, that the novel that I've been working on, which hopefully is going to be called Monopoly Money, I was writing it for a while with the narrator being around 25, 26 years old. And I was in a cafe one day and I looked around and I realized I was the only person in the cafe with a pen and paper. And everybody else was working on a tablet or a laptop. And I said, I have no business writing about 25-year-olds. So I went back to the beginning and I changed the narrator to, instead of 25 and starting out in life, to being 40 and recently divorced. And then I realized I also had to set it about 10 years ago. And when I did that, everything fell into place. And all of a sudden I had access to this guy. I had access to his world. Everything got easy. But I was stupidly just trying to say, yeah, I'll write this and I'll set it last Tuesday. Not so much.
How would you explain, if someone were to ask you, it's not like being a dentist or being an accountant, you know, if someone were to ask you, what does it mean to be a writer? What does it mean to dedicate your life to telling stories? How has that task affected you? And how has it how has it gotten you out of your comfort zone? Or maybe it's kept you in it, all depends.
It definitely gets me out of it. I think, like most of us, certainly you included, you look at the world, or you look at your little corner of the world a certain way. And you feel that sometimes people get it almost right, but for my little corner of the universe, nobody ever got it exactly right, and I wanted to make a record of that. And the other thing that happens to me more with the short stories, I think, than with the longer work is I think a lot in my life about things that came very close to going very, very wrong. Nights that could have ended very differently than the way that they did end. Things that could have changed my career or ended it or resulted in bad things happening. And how very close I came a number of times to that, as I think we all do. And then I think about the people who did have that night, you know, who did not either pull back in time or did not endure it. And those people are not very different than me. And they're, you know, they just had a bad decision that night, or they turned left instead of right at that traffic light. And I decided to start writing about those people. And that's a lot of the characters, at least in my fiction, are the people who, you know, I don't think there's a single one of them that's evil, but, you know, they made a bad decision on a certain day, and this is the road it took them down, which, you know, is the essence of a lot of noir.
Are you willing to talk a little bit about the novel you're working on now?
Yeah. It's called Monopoly Money. The protagonist is a bartender in one of the last Blarney Stone kind of bars down in the Wall Street area, just in the days where the exchange floor is kind of going over to all electronic. So he has been there for a few years, and he's had these guys that in his view were almost like the last of the cowboys to him. These were the last of the old-time, hard-charging guys running around with pieces of paper and yelling and screaming, you know, buy, sell, whatever. And when they would get a break, they would run out to the bar, and it would be 2 shots and a beer because they had 20 minutes, and then they were back on the floor. And he's sort of watching as that world gets smaller and smaller. It goes from 100 guys down to about 30 in the course of the novel. But it's also a murder mystery that I have my protagonist actually, he winds up adopting a dog because the owner has been murdered. And then when he gets a box of stuff that's supposedly stuff about the dog, he finds in there something that is evidence of the murder that other people didn't realize was a murder. And then we're off to the races. But I still have plenty in there about him going back after his divorce to his old apartment that's rent stabilized, and making sure he gets his name on the lease, dealing with the new landlords. It's also a coming of age New York City story in that regard. In a changing city.
All right, as we're winding down, what do you want the world or your audience to get out of this collection? What is as I hope this is the first of many. What was your personal goal to achieve with this thing before you move into another full-length book? After the first time in a while. It's been a while since your last novel, correct?
It has.
Yeah, it's been a while.
I'm going to say 2 things. One, as we touched on a little while ago, the idea that I don't think I'm a very well-traveled person, although I've traveled around a fair amount. I wanted to make a record of my little corner of the universe in a way that I felt no one had, and I think I've done that in this book, and I'm happy with that. And the other is more in the fiction, the sort of to dip into a bit of a cliche, the whole "there but for the grace of God go I." I want them sometimes to be cautionary tales, and I want them, I think if I'm doing it right, I want people to come away being less judgmental about people who have made mistakes and people who may appear to be criminals or part of the criminal class, but they're not. They're just people who haven't had the opportunity others have had, or who have made a bad decision or been down on their luck. And if I'm telling the story correctly, the reader comes away with that.
And now, let's go back to the beginning on where we met. When you and I first met, you edited a wonderful anthology called Brooklyn Noir that has since gestated so many different children in the Akashic catalog. It's lost count. But I mean, you did something really unique in that you decided to collect crime stories in New York based upon the neighborhoods in which they happened, and it was how you and I were brought together because you didn't have anyone to cover Bed-Stuy and didn't know anyone, and so in some weird twist of fate, I get the phone call to contribute to that book, which obviously shook the earth in a lot of different ways. Are there any plans on
your story?
What'd you say?
And I was lucky to get your story.
Oh, thank you. I was coming in late, man. But I really, to be honest, you helped me to grow up as a writer. In that, as a fiction writer, for the first time, I had to deliver 20 pages in some really crazy deadline.
Yep.
And it was like,
I remember us on the phone with editing while I talked to you.
Yeah, I remember. And so, it was one of those things where you introduced me to an entirely new part of New York and an entirely new group of writers. And I guess my question is, are there plans to do another collection of some kind or type?
Nothing solid at the moment, but Johnny Temple and I revisit that from time to time. We have definitely not ruled it out. And, the Noir series has been extraordinary. There are now over 100 of them. and it's been a wonderful, absolutely wonderful experience. And I couldn't even tell you completely how that book came together the way that it did, except that the one thing that I knew that I wanted was I wanted crime stories by people who were not well-known crime writers. I didn't want it to be, I don't want to mention any names, but I didn't want it to be big-time crime writers doing crime stories. I wanted it to be newer people. I also wanted it to be more people who were used to writing a different kind of literature, more literary writers trying to write these kind of stories. And we got lucky. You know, I got you, and I got a handful of people that, you know, carried us over the goal line.
So I guess last question. Out of all the pieces in this book, what is your favorite and why?
I'm going to say two pieces are my favorites, and they're both essays. I'm very pleased with the short stories. I'm very happy with them, but I think the two essays that I mentioned a little while ago to you, the Greg Scarpa piece about the organized crime figure from Bay Ridge, who, as I say in the essay, might just be a civil rights icon, but, you know, maybe not. And the T-shirt seizures. And the reasons that those two would be my favorites are they were the two that were written most recently. And because they are both so very personal, that the Greg Scarpa piece was really hard to write. So I'm pleased that I pulled it off. And then the Ralph and Sam, the T-shirt story, was more me blowing off steam. After I had written that piece, I wanted to lighten the mood. And it was just a fun story that I've been living with for years. And whenever it would come up, somebody would say, well, you have to write that down. So I did. And it turned out to be a pretty easy piece to write in that regard. But between those two pieces, they also represent a kind of big chunk of my life when I was younger. You know, a big chunk of my life growing up and then in my early 20s. And I was happy to make a record of it.
All right. Well, it's been, you know, as time is winding down, it's been the fastest hour ever.
Me too.
You know, it's great, always great talking with you, and, you know, getting into your mind. You're a beautiful stylist in so many ways, shapes, or forms. And I'm going to let you take over and bring us out.
Thank you much, dude.
Guys, thanks so much. I felt like I was away from West Hollywood for a moment and back into old school Brooklyn. This was just a wonderful hour. You guys were terrific. Thanks everyone to Tim and Kenji, and to everyone who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's support and time tonight. Please support your local bookstore and purchase a copy of this terrific book.
No, purchase several.
Yeah.
Yeah, purchase several. Purchase 10.
Also, you're supporting an independent press, which is great. We love our indie presses. So if you'd like any regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Otherwise, that's it for tonight. Have a great evening and stay safe, everyone. Thanks again, guys.
Good night. Thanks, everybody, for coming out.
All right, good night.